a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the co-roundtable for moral capitalism.
Well, Gary, thanks for having me. It's always sort of, I guess, the Minnesota thing. If you're asked to talk about yourself, you suddenly kind of freeze and say, I mean,
Oh, okay. He's
I've had,
Harvard degree in
yeah,
law,
yeah.
and he ran for the United States Senate at least one time, and just a wealth of information relative to how things work around the world. Steve, I admire his work greatly. He works with the Co-Roundtable for Moral Capitalism. And really, this is bringing these ideas from leaders around the world of how capitalism is best suited for our world. And so with that, I'll let you share a little bit more about the co-roundtable,
Well,
since I'll be the Minnesota nice guy and take that off your plate, Steve.
there you go. Thanks, Gary. So personally, I mean, I was not born and raised in Minnesota, from out east, and my profession was law, and then also law teaching. I was graduate of Harvard Law School, went back there to be an assistant dean, came out to Minnesota to be dean of the Hamlin Law School, where we started the Journal of Law and Religion to sort of relate, I think, to your audience, because that also links to the work of moral capitalism, in the sense that I think, and I think this is also deep within the Bible, the Old Testament, and in the teachings of Jesus, that the spiritual and the material are not divided into two kingdoms. Actually, they interpenetrate. So if we divide law off from religion, we narrow ourselves down. If we think about religion as divorced from our daily lives, that's another narrowing. The co-roundtable has this standard of moral capitalism. It was started by really some Minnesota business leaders, several of whom were, well, one, Chuck Denny, was a devout Catholic, but others, like from the Dayton side, were more in the Presbyterian tradition. But they believe that in our lives we can be both moral and practical. We don't. It's not a choice, and that capitalism works best. And Adam Smith actually wrote about this, but everybody's forgotten this. Capitalism works best when it promotes a sense of concern for other people. Adam Smith talked about the moral sense, or what he called the spirit within the breast of the person. Your conscious, your awareness of other people, your awareness of a relationship dimension. And that should affect how you treat your employees, how you treat your customers, how you deal with people who invest in your company, how you should worry about pollution in your community. So the Co-Roundtable has a set of standards and ways of analyzing companies to help them. It's the old quality movement, actually, of getting better and better. And then what we've been doing for a long time, Gary, as you mentioned, internationally, because capitalism is rooted in human nature. It's an international phenomenon. How do we better ourselves in this world by work? We also pick in very much bring in the Protestant notion of vocation, that our work can be a calling. It's not just to make money or for power for ourselves.
Part of the Reformation, major component of the Reformation.
But there are other wisdom traditions and other religions, which, if you look at them openly with sensitivity, they are in harmony with this view. So we think for a more peaceful and more just world community, these different wisdom traditions should be in parallel, and they should be talking to each other.
Let me just jump in here a little bit too.
Yeah.
And let me just jump in here a little bit too. We were very honored to have Steve on with us tonight. I mean, he's in conversation with the Vatican. He's in conversation with other global leaders. And so to have Steve on with us and have him residing right here in Minnesota is just a great blessing for us here in Minnesota. So thank you, Steve. Let me kind of jump forward now. And one of the conversations that really caught my attention, Steve is a great writer. Steve, where can they go get more information of your writings, or how can they find out?
People can go to the Co-Roundtable website. It's a bit of a long name, so it's www. And then co, that's a French word for a place in Switzerland. CAUX, Roundtable, ROUNDTABLE, one word, .org.
.org.
And on there we have blogs and we have papers and we've got our principles. We have ethical principles for business. We have ethical principles for government, which are very relevant right now. Do we have ethical government in America these days? And there's a lot on that website, and I invite everybody to go there, and you'll find our emails. If you have any questions, send me an email. Glad to be in touch.
And again, that's co-roundtable, CAUX roundtable.org. So that's a great place to tune in with that. So let's begin. There's an email that he sent out, I think it was February 9th, if I remember correctly. And it talked about the disappearing middle in the political realm, and the danger that exists as that happens in there. So Steve, I'd like you to kind of explain how our systems work, and then you can kind of bring in where we've been and where we're at, and where it's at. Take us to. So go ahead, Steve.
Try to do that, but we're talking here, Gary, about deep notions about just constitutional rule and history, and I'll try to just kind of make it, a sort of as what should I say, as digestible as possible without bringing up the Federalist Papers and reading them or something. But fundamentally, the purpose of our constitutional republic, if we read in John Locke and the Federalist Papers, is to be aware of concentrations of power, which
Correct.
are irresponsible. And by definition, extremes, a king, a mob, they concentrate power for themselves, and therefore they become a danger to the whole system, because they try to impose their values, their ideas, they try to extract money. So the framers in the Constitution, as I think we all know, created a system of checks and balances. So one way of doing that was to have three different branches of divide your political power between a legislature, an executive, and a court. And then you have elections. So you force powerful people to go to the ordinary people and ask for and get their support. Now, in the 18th century, they also presumed that, and there's a good story about Benjamin Franklin on this one, maybe I'll share, that in order for this constitutional system to work, you had to have the right kind of moral people.
Right.
And the Franklin story, which we've heard mentioned the last year or so, especially after the election last November. So the story of Franklin is apparently the last day of the Constitutional Convention, and he's walking down the building, which we now call, Independence Hall, and he's walking home, and some very proper, sort of refined, dignified lady in Philadelphia is walking past, and she sees him, and he recognizes her, and she says something like, Mr. Franklin, what kind of a government have you given us? And Franklin's retort is, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And that was well understood by educated people in the 18th century, that keeping it depended on virtue.
Morality.
Our virtue, morality, religion, and virtue is a concept that goes back to Roman times. It goes back to Aristotle. It's paralleled in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And therefore, being a citizen, keeping your republic, is up to the citizens by having virtue. Now, virtue was defined way back then by Aristotle, was a mean. It was balancing different things. It was checks and balances within ourselves. Not too much of me, but not too much of you. And so there was this whole notion of a center, of people coming together. Now, the next point is, in a checks and balances system, it forces compromise.
Right. Steve, let me jump in here. Yeah. I want to reintroduce yourself again as well. And you are joining us tonight for First Tuesday Conservatives with Alpha News. And this is Gary Borgendale, and I'm your fill-in guest host tonight. And joining is Steve Young. He is the Global Executive Director of the Co-Roundtable for Moral Capitalism. And we're in the topic of the loss of the middle. What does that mean to America? And Steve has just been sharing about the foundations in quoting Benjamin Franklin, as a republic, if you can keep it, and what that moral foundation required. So sorry, Steve, I just want to reintroduce.
That's great. Thanks, Gary.
Go ahead.
So the next point, I think, is compromise and checks and balances. And what compromise does is it forces things to be balanced, to be in the center. The old phrase a long time ago was log rolling, like in the early days of the Republic. I get a little bit, but you get a little bit. I don't ram it down your throat. You don't ram it down my throat. That brings us together, and we have to learn. And the other thing that happens now is with virtue, we trust each other. The next thing is, which has changed, and probably is one of the things that's been driving the change, is for a long, long time, until about the 1970s, 1980s, our two big political parties worked in the center. Their mechanism was to build bridges and achieve compromise. So the Democrats, people forgot about this. The Democrats used to be, say under Franklin Roosevelt, were liberals from the North and white Southerners in the South.
Correct.
And the Democratic Party had to keep those people together. The great Democratic city machines in New York City, in Chicago, they had to bring together Italians, Jews, Irish, Catholics, Protestants, this and that. And we all know kind of how they did it. Sometimes it wasn't always on the up and up, but
it was done.
But they got it done. And the Republican
Right.
Party too had very conservative people and less conservative people. And the role of the party leaders was to bring people together. The way they picked their candidates, the broker. Yep. Now, with the reforms that were introduced by McGovern and the Democrats reacting to the Vietnam War, we changed all that. We basically have weakened the parties because we've put the fundraising with individual campaigns. Now, this was something I learned from Rudy Boschwitz in the 1990s when I was getting involved in politics. I'd been a law school dean and I tried to be very fair. My personal views were my personal views, but with my responsibility to the school, to its graduates, I needed to be open to everybody. But when I did get involved in Republican politics, the genius of fundraising is to tap emotions.
Absolutely.
Not wise thought. So what's been happening for a long time is to raise money, you got to get people stirred up. The more you stir them up, the more money you get. The more money you get, the more TV advertising you can buy, the more likely you are to win and go to Washington or St. Paul or whatever. But what that's done is when the political parties in the middle get weak and they kind of go down like this and emotional campaigns arise, they tend to look more towards the emotions, which tend to go to extremes.
Well, let me play this out a little bit for you as I see it, that you have, it's this tremendous fundraising from political as well as conservative and liberal organization. So if it's the Heritage the Heritage Center, or if there's Family Research Center, or if it's the ACEOL on the left, see that these organizations, if I see this, then Steve, not only are the parties using this divide and the emotion to pull us apart, but the organizations are as well. And so now we have the liberals continually being emphasized on racism, on equality, diversity, and then on the right is here's our God-ordained morals, and it's like we're losing our country, and both sides are basically saying the same thing. So it's not only the political parties, but it's the organizations that raise tremendous amounts of money on that very same thing. Steve, go ahead again.
Right. So the next big force, which has been working underneath. So this is the sort of the mechanism. Underneath the mechanism are deeper forces, and we've had a culture war going on since the 1960s. Something new in American history, the creation of a new elite based really on colleges and education. And I think, you and I are sort of closer to the founding generation. I mean, I go back to SDS, 1962, the Port Huron Statement, which at the time people didn't pay any attention to.
Well, say, what is that, SDS?
Well, SDS was the Students for Democratic Society, 1962. They were the first in the 60s, they were called the New Left. They were breaking off with the old Marxist, Stalinist, socialist left and creating a cultural movement. Tom Hayden was sort of the leader of that, and they came up with this political manifesto, 1962, which talked about using higher education and colleges, universities to educate a new group of sort of like a new vanguard class of enlightened people who should therefore rule the country because they were wiser and more moral and everything. And that idea has grown and grown and grown until now we see the whole woke movement, which is becoming sort of trying to sort of like the only proper way for people to think and talk. And racism has been used as an ideology, right? And it's my way or the highway. And early on, of course, we had parallel to this rise was one, increasing secularization. The younger people, younger generations and others no longer as traditionally religious as their parents and grandparents.
The nuns.
We had the very divisive effect of the anti-war movement, which in retrospect to me, because I volunteered and I served and I speak Vietnamese, in retrospect, that was one of these first sort of narratives or of, why America is basically evil. And this narrative was developed. I mean, I remember it when I was in college. It was developed in order to justify draft dodging. In other words, my generation of American men, right? Our dads had fought in World War II in Korea, most of us, right?
Right.
Vietnam comes along and we don't want to go. We don't want to serve. So rather than look to ourselves and say we're spoiled brats or something or other, no, we come to this judgment, and the anti-war movement was started by intellectuals on the campuses, right? Who borrowed from the French, who'd been the colonial power in Vietnam. And they came up with this narrative, 65 and 66, that America was bringing anti-communism and capitalism to these wonderful poor people in Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh was a great leader, and I ain't gonna serve. So in an example, in my graduating class at Harvard College, Gary, 1967, I can't remember the details, but I think there were 1,200 to 1,300 young men graduating from Harvard College, who today they're in their 70s. Right. And I don't know, I don't know all of them, but my guess is 90+% have had pretty good lives, right? They've got a lot of money, they've had houses, their kids have gone to good colleges, they've been lawyers, doctors, all this stuff. They've been part of the American elite, right? Of the 1,200 to 1,300 men in my graduating class, how many do you think served in the Vietnam War?
Probably 5%. 5 people?
About 5 people.
Maybe
another 5. And I don't know everybody. I mean, I know 5 guys who served. There might be another 5, and there may be another 25 who were drafted and served somewhere else. Like, let's round it up. Let's say 50. 50 out of 1,200. That was a break with American traditions of patriotism and service. And I think we can start seeing from that break the beginning of the collapse of the center, as I call it, which is because the center is belief in law, the rule of law, American institutions, American patriotism, American idealism. And now it's, you don't find 70% of Americans believing in the goodness of this country anymore.
Let's kind of speed up a little bit here and bring us up into really the 2000s and kind of where we're at. I really noticed that separation, and as we describe it, is the middle is compromisable. It has built relationships with those people across the aisle. I think of Tip O'Neill and to a certain case, John McCain. But that is kind of going away. So kind of bring us up to speed, Steve, where we are maybe prior to the 2016 election and now where we are after the 2020 election.
Yeah, I mean, so much to cover, Gary, but I think the culture war gets played out in politics. To me, what I call a new class of highly credentialed people from education, more and more sort of, and we have high-tech companies coming along. These are people, they're more on the Democratic side, some on the Republican side, but they no longer represent either the solid middle class of the past or the working class. They have white-collar jobs. and they're very comfortable with a managed economy and a managed society.
Right.
And Reagan is a response to them, I think, because a lot of Americans sense this, and they voted for Reagan, and he talked about morning in America again. We then had George H.W. Bush as president, and he was not, I don't know how to describe him. I think he saw himself as kind of a patrician, and wasn't really comfortable with a lot of emotions, and didn't understand this movement coming from the left. Now, Bill Clinton, very clever, sees this in the Democratic Party, but positions himself. He and Jimmy Carter, for a long time, were Southern whites who could put together a coalition for the Democrats.
Right.
And so the phrase from Dick Morris back then with Bill Clinton was triangulation, compromise. Then after Clinton, we had George W. Bush, and you began to feel more of the sort of the split. I think the serious thing was when, and I was misled at the time, because Barack Obama talked about being a centrist, but then as we saw with him, this tensions beginning to emerge around sort of social justice issues and kind of race.
Right.
Something sort of going on there, that somehow something about race that was in America, which sort of laid the foundation for what we've heard since last year, that white supremacy, systemic racism, whiteness as a fundamental part of America, which, I mean, I just think it's not true. I mean, I was in the civil rights movement. I was at the end of the march from Selma. The victory of the civil rights movement put an end to white segregation and white racism.
In the South.
In the South, because that was a Southern thing, right? It was never part of the American experience. It was a Southern thing. It was a different case.
Let me jump in here. I want to go back a little bit from my own standpoint. I guess I'm the host, so I can do this a little bit. I'm a follower of Christ, and I see what has taken place in our country. If I go back to the first Great Awakening, was about 1740 to 1760, and it was really setting the stage for the American Revolution. The pastors were called the Black Robe Regiment because they were speaking the truth and they were sharing that. And that's who King George feared more than anything else, was the Black Robe Regiment. And it was very quickly, though, that morality fell away. And they talk about hardly any student in the early 1800s at Harvard was a follower of Christ. So it went away very quickly. And so that brought forth probably the second Great Awakening that took place probably about a little after 1800, more or less 1830s to about 1860, that really set the stage for the moral capitalism, if I can choose that from you, Steve, for the ending the slavery and really pushing that forward. So we have this deep Protestant, Judeo-Protestant combination setting the stages for this. And, I have to fault the Christian church for a lot of where we're at, because the ministers and the pastor leaders failed to integrate faith in all parts of life. We kind of like, well, we'll separate it and we'll have our faith component on Sunday, but we'll let the world go from there. So I want to set that stage, because we'll come back to that in conversation a bit. But I want to go back to you, Steve, now, and kind of take us, you were talking about Barack Obama and that separation that started to happen with him. And I would venture to say that accelerated with President Trump.
Yes, and I think going back to the point we talked about fundraising and emotions, I sense that really began working in the 90s. And that's when the sort of the polarization was being pushed on us by the politicians. And it was basically, I think, working on emotions to emphasize our differences. In other words, give me money because I'm not like Gary. Gary's a bad guy. If you give me money, I'll defeat Gary. And you were going out and saying, no, give me money because Steve's a bad guy. He's a liberal. He's a this. He's a that. And I would say, well, Gary's a conservative, or he's this. And what started to happen, and this is a lot of people, because I think most Americans are basically good people. They're moderate people. They care. They work hard, but they're not comfortable with this politics. So more and more people began to drop out. The center people, I predict, they haven't gone away. They're just not participating. So if you look at political participation, you get something like a two-hump camel. The people who do the graphs call it a bimodal curve. You got a bunch of people over here to my left, and you got a bunch of people over here to my right, but they're like 25% each. In the middle between them are like 50% of the American people. But there's no political party that's organizing the middle. And another problem we've heard about in politics on both sides since the 60s is it's very hard to raise money from moderates.
Right.
Moderates don't get all up. You can't. It's hard to motivate moderates. So moderates are sort of there. They're looking at the rise of this, but they don't see who represents me.
Right. Steve, let me jump in here.
Yeah.
I think this one graph really depicts it. So I'm going to try and share this with our viewers. Can we see this graph? Am I sharing it? Can you see that, Steve?
Yeah, I can see it. Yes.
And this is what you were talking about, is that the center and then what's happening now to the center, how it is gone away and causing major issues. So that's what we talk about in the center. The extreme is 3% on both sides. The center has been 50%, but now as you see the center going to that 15%. So I think it's just a great visual, Steve, and I'm gonna stop sharing now so we can continue.
The other thing, guys, we in Minnesota, a number of years ago, I think had one of the first actual demonstrations in politics of this dynamic, which was the election of Jesse Ventura, which I haven't seen people remember or talk about very much. But if you remember, there were three candidates in that election. There was Jesse, and then there was Norm Coleman, who was the Republican.
Right.
And then there was Skip Humphrey, Hubert Humphrey's son, as the Democrat. And by, I think, the pressures of the two parties, Norm had to sort of go more as far to the right as he could to get support from the Republicans. Skip had to go more and more towards the left to get support from the Democratic apparatus. That left a space in the middle into which Jesse stepped as an independent. You remember, Jesse ran in the early years. He was positioning himself as, I'm not a party person. I'm an independent. I'm here for you. I want to listen. I'm just an average guy. You know, I was just mayor of a town and this and this. And I'll always tell you the truth. And it was this person, and he won. And I think the numbers were, Jesse had maybe 37%.
Yeah.
Norm had maybe 31. And I think Skip Humphrey was the big disappointment. He came in like at 25.
Right.
But that showed to me, that was one of the first times I began sort of paying attention, what's going on here? That there were a lot of people whom I think were trying to send a message by voting for Jesse. Now, from my point, and I had a couple of friends who were very close to Jesse, worked in his campaign or his administration, and their frustration was Jesse had no interest in setting up his own party. Jesse was all for Jesse. Right?
Dean Blakely. Yeah.
And so what would have happened if Jesse had tried to put together some kind of a movement with ideas, with a vision, with outreach, you know, to churches, to unions, to this, to that, drawing some people from the Democrats and some people from the Republicans around a program of limited government, but just government, and strong private sector economics, but with care for the poor people,
right?
And some compromise on values, somewhere in there. So something where most Americans would feel this is sort of, it's common sense. It makes sense. We're trying to build up our private sector, our private economy, private power, private values, private churches and everything. But at the same time, we recognize that we need good roads, good bridges. We need to take care of the poor. We need to take care of people who, as Christ was teaching with, the Good Samaritan. If somebody is hurt and lying on the side of the road, you don't just walk by.
Right, right. You go back and serve that. I'm going to share one more graph. I think it really puts where we are here, Steve. So let me do this. And this is the kind of the telltale sign that just grabbed my attention big time. And I apologize, I don't have all this technology quite worked out. But if you see, can you see this, Steve? Can you see this?
I can see it. Yes, I can see it. Yes.
In 2004. Can you explain this a little bit? Because this was really the telltale, and this is at 2017. So just kind of walk us through this graph a little bit, Steve.
Well, I think maybe, look, people, to pay most attention to the two white vertical lines. So what you notice in 1994, these two vertical lines are pretty close to each other. In 2017, which is what you were talking earlier about, after Donald Trump's election, 2016 being a divide, these two vertical white lines are wide apart. What that indicates, those lines are the median for the Democrats and the Republicans. And what we've seen is the Democrats have moved more to the left and the Republicans have moved more to the right. And the purple color in the middle are the centrists.
And that's declined
greatly. And those are people who are Democrats and Republicans, but they're not so many. They have been moving to the extremes. Right. So we're less and less able to draw on people to compromise. Now, Gary, what this brings up, and frankly, I haven't thought about this very much, but we're now getting close to the experience of many, many families and friends since 2016 and Trump, where we used to be able to talk about politics and culture at the Christmas dinner table, around Thanksgiving table, and you don't do that anymore,
right?
Because people within families and friends have become enemies because you're on one side or the other, and if you tell me that you're on that side and I don't like it, I don't give you any credibility. I no longer take you at face value. I don't treat you with respect. I don't listen with you. I just say you're a bad person. So and this polarization has led to, I mean, the people in the argument, how do you persuade people? It's called an ad hominem argument. We don't pay attention to your ideas anymore, Gary. We stereotype you as a person. We name you and we disparage you. We say you're a bad person, therefore your ideas must be bad, which Correct. Is completely fallacious and stupid. Even bad people can say 2 + 2 is 4, right? Even bad people can tell the truth sometimes.
And this permeates all sectors of our culture, from education, from business. We see the diversity, equity, and inclusion really coming into the major corporations. And so we have this converging, if you will, of these more liberal ideas in these different institutions, and that it's separating from a conservative or moral foundation, and it's the left and right won't talk to each other. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's former mayor of St. Paul and a Democrat, and I really raised this question with him. I said, Mayor, we're not talking to each other. How can you and I, as a Republican conservative, have a conversation? He says, that's right, Gary. I'm willing to do that, because he recognized that we're in dire straits if we don't have this dialogue, this conversation, if we don't have a mutually shared set of values. That's not good. And yeah, Steve,
but if we look into history, French Revolution, on all kinds of things, the collapse of Russia, Third World, when people get polarized and you start stigmatizing others, you're slipping into an incipient civil discord and maybe war. I remember, I didn't cut it out, I wish I did, years ago when the Yugoslavia broke up. And remember that the two big people there were the Croats, or there were three groups: the Croats, the Serbs, and then the Bosnians.
Right.
And the Bosnians, as I remember, were ethnically Serbian people who converted to Islam. And there was this woman, it was a full-page story in the New York Times, as I remember, several years into the war and the killings and everything. And they're interviewing this woman from a small village. It was mostly Serbs and Croats, I think, in Bosnia. And she said two things. She said, one, If we had known in the early years where it would have ended up, we would have stopped it. But nobody thought it would ever get that bad.
Right. Right.
And then the second thing she said, that at the time it got bad and the killing started, it was too late. And then she described the process of you could either say escalation or you could say collapse, because in that particular town, it's at state zero, there had begun to be intermarriages between Serbs and Croats. So you had Croatian families, Serbian, and there were some other families where the husband was one, and people lived intermingling. Then Yugoslavia starts to break up. The Serbs start talking about, we are the great people. And bit by bit, the housing patterns began to change. People began to socialize differently. Croats with Croats, Serbs with Serbs, and then Croats who were living in a Serbian bloc, they'd move to be with Croats. So then you had segregation of the people. Then the next thing that started to happen was with the kids. The kids would start calling each other names. You're a Serbian so-and-so, you're a Croat so-and-so. And intermarriages stopped. Then the next thing that started to happen was graffiti. Serbian kid would go to a Croat house and write on the side of the house, Croats go home or something, right?
Yep.
But nobody, at no point is the community or the mayors or the religious leaders doing anything. They're just kind of looking the other way. Then the next thing that happens is fights among the teenagers in the school. Then the lady said, after the first killing, there was no turning back.
Right. So, kind of terrifying story. So, where would you say the United States is then, Steve? And what's our path forward?
Well, I'm very worried, guy. I mean, I've never been so worried for my. I'm a guy who fought in Vietnam. I've done lots of stuff. As a kid, my gut instinct was that we would prevail in the Cold War, which we did, against the Soviets and the Chinese. I never thought that the American people, the American Republic, would run the danger of self-destruction and collapse as we turned against each other, and part of us turned against our ideals. That's what worries me about this critical race theory, critical thinking. It's creating narratives which are not rooted in faith and truth and goodwill, in order for some people to have an ideology so that they can seize power. And I don't see in them goodwill and respect for other people. What that does is that sets up a counter reaction, which I think we saw in January 6th at the US Capitol. As the Democrats said in horror, is unimaginable, unprecedented. My question was, yes, it's unprecedented, so why is it happening?
Right.
Things like this don't happen by accident. There are causes, right? So what are the underlying causes? That's what we have to look at in order to solve the problem. I think several things. I mean, I think one, there's a responsibility of religious leaders to become much more active in the civic sphere, not with politics, but about virtue, about being a good person, about listening. Secondly, we have to take a look at all our educational institutions, public schools, teachers unions, and universities, because they have become recruitment mechanisms for this very narrow-minded class. And I think we should begin building new alternate institutions. It's sort of, the public choice system, charter schools, homeschooling writ large. A crucial change I would make, or I would at least try to get a discussion on, is tenure at universities. Let's do away with tenure, because tenured professors are making $100,000, $120,000, teaching very few people, not responsible to the society anymore. They're just promoting their own careers, and they're basically extracting rents. And lots of Americans have run into $1.8 trillion worth of debt, which has gone to support these institutions, which are not building virtuous Americans.
That's
to me, that doesn't compute.
That's the debt owed by students.
But they borrowed money to pay to institutions to go to the salaries of professors and staff. who are they're kind of like a sort of a religion with a small r. I mean, they have sort of this ideology around critical thinking. They're not protecting freedom of speech. They're not protecting freedom of thought. They're not even educating people the way they used to. They're training narrow specialists. I mean, what young person is really a good student anymore of liberal arts, of history, of literature?
Very few.
And if you don't have that, then how can you think about human nature? How can you reach out to other people? You don't even know how to listen to other people.
And see, any other points, Steve? I'm going to kind of wrap this up, but I want to make sure I've got other points that you wanted to share.
No, I think this is sort of getting, my worry out. But I think, again, the simple answer for the future is the old one from the union movement: organize. And it was the same movement for the civil rights movement: organize.
Organize. Well, I think it's very true. And I guess that one of the things I had the opportunity to work on Coalition for Impartial Justice with Governor Quee some years ago. And that was a very interesting, and it was a great system for me. I was probably the most conservative person on that. But then I was with these other more liberal people, and we became friends. And so we understood more about each other. And I'm so blessed to have that opportunity. And so to me, one of the things I see is that you really purposely have to reach out to somebody on, maybe not really on the far left, but at least into that Democrat side, and have a conversation with them. Where are we going? Because if we don't recognize the issue that's before us, we're going to end up in a similar situation when you talk about Yugoslavia. It's that you're ugly, you're dumb, and okay, we keep going from there. I know those fights have happened in the high schools already here in Minnesota. So they're the cusp, but we as Americans need to step forward on that. And
there's a couple other points I want to make real fast. One is, and this is pretty serious, it's hard to talk about, but it's when you start defining other people as like a different race, nothing in common with you, then you're setting everything up for civil strife. And the examples of this were, I mean, the one I sort of lived through a little bit was Pol Pot in Cambodia, where he came up with an intellectual, a narrative, a classification, a construct called the new population and the old population. And the old population were the Cambodians who'd lived under Khmer Rouge control, and they had their minds cleansed, right? They didn't have any property, they were okay. Then the sort of the government and the good Cambodians, they collapsed, part of the loss of the Vietnam War. All those people were in the cities were called the new population, and the new population were defined as basically infected, like they'd had some kind of virus. And so they were moved out of the cities, moved in camps in rural areas, and either left to die or they were killed because they were not seen as part of us.
The killing fields.
The killing fields. And what the cadres used to say, because I was out there in '78 trying to say that, is that the Khmer Rouge cadres would say to people, I'd say, Gary, if you live, we gain nothing. If you die, we lose nothing. So why not kill you today? But because we created this construct that created in the image of God, you're not really a good person. That's what worries me about what this elite is doing. It's marginalizing people, it's demeaning people, it's giving justification for ignoring them and just pushing them aside. Right. And I don't see in any way how that is good or moral or virtuous.
And one of the things that, again, I'm a follower of Christ, and with the Derek Chauvin trial on Sunday, there was probably about 300 pastors downtown at the Hennepin County Convention Center, black, white, male, female, and praying for God to bring peace and justice into the situation. And so I look at this as we've experienced the first and second Great Awakening, that maybe God in his providence would provide a third Great Awakening, and we would return to that Judeo-Christian foundation that established our state and our country. And so that's my prayer and my encouragement to others out there. This is very serious stuff. It's not kind of just placating the left and the right. And we need to have those conversations with those people across the aisle and really raise this question, because if we don't, we're going to end up in a bad situation. So
a final point maybe is I would like to see, and this may be very controversial on both sides, I would like to see the word liberal with a capital L brought back as a very good word, because in the old meanings of liberal, it is being an open-minded person. It is being a constructive person. And I think the conservatives made a mistake in trying to label the left as liberal, because for most Americans, liberal is still kind of a good word. I think we have to define the left for what it is. It's a left. It's an ideological program based on culture now more than class, but it's an ideological program which is totalitarian at its core, and it's left. And liberal should be redefined as people of goodwill, open-mindedness, who are willing to work together, who have a sense of vocation, and are committed to the maybe, Gary, we could say this, the pilgrimage of the American people. Because I'm one of the ones, probably like you, who have a realization that all of us, in some sense, are weak, we're failed, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
And therefore, we're not going to get to the in our time, human beings cannot create God's order. The best we can do is follow a pilgrimage, right? To become better and better. And if we could promote a sense of pilgrimage, and recognize the Civil War, what Lincoln did. Lincoln talked about reparations. 300,000 young volunteer white guys from the North died. That's the Civil Rights Movement was another step on the pilgrimage. Okay, we want to take some more steps on the pilgrimage today, but what does a good pilgrim do? I don't think you go out and you try to just deny other people their humanity. That's not what a pilgrim does.
And demean them. Well, we've had a great conversation again this evening about the loss of the middle and what that means to Minnesota and to America. And so again, to get more information about Steve Young, he's the Global Executive Director for Cole Roundtable for Moral Capitalism. You can go to his website, the Cole Roundtable, and it's spelled CAUX roundtable.org. And I encourage you to check out some of the articles he's written there and get on the email, because this is kind of the topics that we need to continue to have conversation about. Steve, any last comment before we wind up here?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity, Gary, to talk to you and to sort of frankly share a lot of my worries and my frustrations.
Yes, thank you, Steve. It's great having you with us. And then if you're a follower of Christ, as I am, I would really encourage you to pray, because this is dire straits and we need that intervention of God again in our land as he has done in the past. So with that, this is Gary Borgendale signing off for Alpha News and First Tuesday Conservatives. And join us next time as we have more conversations about where we are in Minnesota and the United States. Thanks very much, Steve, and have a good night.
Thank you, Gary.